In this video, I would like to offer a systematic comment of the beginning of this book, Reason in History by Hegel, which is probably Hegel's most famous book. And there's a preface, a presentation by a man named Kostas Papaioannou, who was a Greek-French scholar, and I would like to comment his words. And I would like to express the fact that I am a conflicted being. I am a singular individual, the individual that you see, and I am just me, and I am selfish, and I have my flaws and my weaknesses and my evil tendencies as a selfish singular self. But I am also a particular being. For instance, I am a male, I am a product of my generation, I'm in my late 20s, I am a European, these are my particularities, and that you can partly see also by looking at me. But I have also a universality within me which is only graspable through my speech. You cannot see my words, you can only listen to them and try to extract the meaning and see for yourself whether what I say is true or not. So truth is true for every thinking consciousness. Truth is universal. Whatever your nationality, your origin, your age, your background, your culture, truth is the same for all. But I am not just universal, I am particular and singular also, and I have these three aspects of me in my own being, and I know that this is the source of all my conflicts and all my suffering. And as an individual, I don't know who speaks when I say this, but I have a special relationship with Europe, and I can only understand myself by understanding Europe. And I would like to talk about the history of the past 5 centuries in Europe briefly in a Hegelian perspective, and this is the chronological aspect of the video, of the text that I will comment in the video. The author says that Reason in History is the most accessible of Hegel's books, and that reason consists in grasping the whole of reality, namely all the aspects of reality, and the examples that he gives are the unity of consciousness, politics and culture. So to simplify, it's the realm of objective spirit, politics, law, economics, sociology, history, the realm of culture, which is the artistic expressions of an era or of a people, the religious inclinations, the philosophical speculations, and consciousness, the relationship of mind to all these aspects. And consciousness is a subjective mind living in a body, which is itself determined by natural determination. So to have a rational understanding of our time, because we live in the 21st century, is to understand the determinations of our time in all their aspects. And to think about the whole world is a Herculean task. And as an individual, with my limitations, I have unconsciously tried to think about the Western world. But because the West is in relation with the rest of the world, I indirectly know about the world, but I am most familiar with the Western world and the European tradition. And I can only speak of what I know. And I will begin the chronological comment. he explains that in the Renaissance, so broadly the 15th century, early 16th century, up until the Renaissance in the European tradition, the world, during the Middle Ages, the world was thought of as a coherent and structured whole, a totality, where every aspect had its place within the whole, and the world was thought of as a sphere, so to speak, where the above, the heavenly starry sky, and the below, the earthly existence were structured and ordered. And this was called the cosmos. There was the implicit idea of an order. And in the Renaissance, this view of a cosmic totality, which had structured and shaped the Middle Ages, for better and worse, one might say, started to fall apart, because with the rise of the printing press and the development of new ideas coming from the falling Byzantine Empire, the rediscovery of the ancient authors, the discovery of the New World, being confronted by other peoples in very different modes of existence, forced the Europeans to question themselves, to question their mode of living, to question their religious beliefs, their philosophical belief, and it introduced a wealth of new ideas and a bursting forth of questions about who we are, so to speak. And the author says that nature and mind have become two poles in a polarity, in a relationship of polarity, of reality, so that the mind is opposed, like in a magnetic polarity, to nature, the realm of time and space and matter. And that nature becomes an object to the mind, an object to study and to exploit. And it is the birth, at the end of the Renaissance and at the beginning of what we call the modern age, in the early 17th century. It's the transitional period between the end of the Renaissance at the end of the 16th century and the birth of the classical age in the beginning of the 17th century. That we have the rising of thinkers and scientists like Francis Bacon, Descartes, Galileo, and later in the century Newton. And they are the Descartes, Galileo, and Bacon are the fathers, the founding fathers of modern science and of the modern world, because science, as we understand it, has shaped the entire world for the past 4 centuries. And it gave birth to Newton, which is probably one of the most influential minds ever. And Newton gave birth to modern science, modern technology, and every epistemological discovery, like the science of economics and sociology, has tried to shape itself, to structure itself in relation to the physical view of Newton, to apply the physical model of Newton to the realm of sociology or economics and so on and so forth. And the author explains that since the Renaissance, kind of this cosmic unity has been broken, and that now man is a subject confronting an objective world and feeling alienated and separated and disconnected from the world. And this is a cause of questioning, of inquiry, and of suffering also, the sense of the loss of unity. And he says that before the advent of modern science, man knew himself to be part of an objective order, to be a part of a cosmos, of a structured totality. And there was the idea, and we find this in the preface of Hegel's Phenomenology also, that there was a sovereign presence, that the divine was pervading all aspects of existence, that life was not necessarily easy, but they felt the presence of the divine in nature, in the myth, in the songs, in the institutions, in the ways of life, in the civic community. That's the romantic view of the Middle Ages that we have. And the breaking off brought about by the mind of the Renaissance, and especially the mind of classical science, the Cartesian, Galilean, Baconian, Newtonian mind of the modern objective scientific mindset, brought about at the end of the 18th century, but already before, but especially in the Romantic movement at the end of the 18th century and the turning point of the 19th century, a nostalgia for the Middle Ages. In 18th century Europe, the Middle Ages were considered to be a barbaric, primitive, dark age. And I believe that in English we say the Dark Ages to express the Middle Ages. There was this idea of ignorance and filth and religious bigotry and so on and so forth, and that we, in the 18th century, we lived an age of enlightenment, of reason, of dispassionate, rational consideration of things, and the Enlightenment brought about its own dialectical negation, one might say, in the birth of Romanticism, and the Romantics felt attracted to the Middle Ages because it had, according to them, a sense of a holistic aspect of life, a sense of all the aspects of existence being made present in the community, a unity of man with nature, of man with man in his community, of man with God through the myth and the religious practices. And this feeling of the presence of the divine throughout all aspects of existence is kind of pagan in a way, and it's kind of romantic also. And he says, yeah, that there was an epistemological break-off in the Renaissance, which made Europeans feel a sense of loss, separation, estrangement, alienation, because suddenly the universe was not an ordered totality, but was an infinitely vast being, with apparently no inner order. They started to question God, the existence of God. There were religious questions by the discovery of the native populations of America. It forced them to question the truth of Christianity. The confrontation by the wisdom of the pagans through the mediation of the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans forced them to question their own knowledge. And what if the pagans of antiquity were more intelligent and more inspired than the Christian? There were religious questions, political questions, with writers such as Machiavelli and Thomas More. The utopia, the will to reorganize life politically. It was the birth of political utopias with the revolt of the peasants in Germany and in Central Europe, the Reformation, artistic expressions, the Renaissance, the rediscovery of mystical teachings. The Renaissance, so the 15th and 16th century in Europe, was an age of discovery, of questioning, of rediscovery, of an outburst of ideas, an exuberant manifestation of intellectual life in the spiritual, intellectual, political, scientific, and an outburst of artistic creativity. It was really a confused, conflicted, Dionysian moment, one could speak, in the life of Europe, and it was contradictory and conflicting, and that's why probably in a dialectical fashion that we are not yet aware of, the Renaissance gave birth to the classical age, the age of reason in the 17th century, an attempt to rationalize, to clarify, to structure in a classical sense, to distinguish clearly. We had the rise of, in France, we have the classical age of aesthetics, architecture, the theater, the organization of science. So it's an age of, the 17th century was a profoundly religious age, but God was now considered as some sort of mathematician or a rational principle. So it was already a purely intellectual God, which would give birth to the theistic or deist God of the 18th century, which was even less involved in the world. The watchmaker, yeah, as Voltaire said, the watchmaker. So God was already losing himself in a way, if one might say. And there's a quote from a poem from an English author, I guess. "It's all in pieces, all coherence is gone." So there's this idea that the coherent totality has been lost by the rise of the modern mind. And people experience the feeling of the loss of the whole and the replacement of this feeling of the totality by a quantitative measuring mind, the empirical mind, the divisive, quantifying mind. And the author says that before the Renaissance, God was thought of as being the ordering intelligence of reality and the source of all the values. So he was both an architect, an ordering principle, and a moral principle. And this loss of the feeling of substantiality brought about by the Renaissance and the age of science brought forth a sense of nostalgia for the Middle Ages. And the Romantic era is a very important moment in the development of the European spirit, and it has had tremendous consequences in both art and also religion and politics. The Romantic idea has had a tremendous influence upon the whole development of 19th century Europe and 20th century Europe, and still today in the rebirth of the rise of the pagan communities, the pagans, the European pagans who are spontaneously attracted by their native religion, they are living a romantic experience in the philosophical sense, but they are not necessarily aware of this because they may not know their own history and the history of Europe, but hopefully they will stumble upon this video and I might help them understand their perspective and their place in the process of rediscovering themselves and rediscovering their own spirit. He says that the rise and the development of the exact sciences of physics, mechanics, and later chemistry in the 18th century gave the feeling of a loss, of an ontological loss, like being was being mutilated and divided and torn apart and being lost, so to speak. And there was a great divide between the knowledge provided by the modern exact sciences about what the objective world is and the experience of the world that we consider real, because the modern scientific mind tells us that everything is a collection of atoms and that the universe has no purpose, it's just atoms in motion. And we find these ideas in Bacon and Hobbes and partly Locke and the French materialist of the 18th century, and Newton, of course. The idea that all meaning is gone, that we are just movements of atoms wandering in the infinite vastness of a purposeless universe. And just to illustrate an example, there's a French physicist teacher who made an intervention on the radio about the migrants a few years ago, and she said that from a materialist standpoint, we are all just collections of atoms, so we should accept migrants because they are just quantitative determination of atoms, and so are we. So on the atomic level, we're all the same. So we should accept migrants. So it's kind of, which is true. From a physical standpoint, it's perfectly true. But in the mind of those kind of right-wing Europeans, the feeling that they have of the experience of welcoming migrants and the reality of the objective scientific mind is different. So it creates a divide. And this historical moment in the development of the European consciousness is the moment when, according to the author, history replaces the cosmos or the revelation in the Bible or in the Christian religion as a source of meaning. Humanism, which rises or is reborn, because it already partly existed in ancient Greece and Rome to a certain extent, but it was being born again, that man became the center of the universe and the center of the world and the source of all meaning and truth instead of God. It was a long process, and there were reactions against this, but the idea of the Renaissance was to bring man back to the center of the world. and now it was the product of man, namely history, and not the product of God, namely the creation or nature, which was being at the center. And we started to have a revival in the interest in history, in the history of the Greeks and the Romans, who were standards of virtue and of creativity and of wisdom. And now there was a comparison between the pagan world and the Christian Middle Ages, and the authors of the Renaissance were forced to admire the brilliance and the genius of the pagan authors of the past. So it questioned the meaning of Christianity. And Whitehead says that the Reformation was an attempt to go back to the roots, to the primordial roots of Christianity, to purify the Christian experience of all the useless, how do you call it, the non-necessary ornaments in the form of the Catholic Church, and to go back to the roots of the Christian experience of religion. That was the will of the early Protestants. So European man experienced a loss of transcendence and also of presence, because transcendence is the presence of that which is not present, so to speak. It is present by being absent, so to speak. That's very Hegelian. And the pagans in the modern world, and you, if you watch this video, you might be a pagan, a European pagan. There's a high probability that you are. You are seeking to experience the presence of a transcendence, and the characteristic of the modern pagan revival among Europeans is a will to find a presence of the divine or the spiritual within nature, within reality, not in an above, God knows where, heaven, but within the world, by being united and having a fully substantial experience of being. So in paganism, there's this idea that, to speak like Hegel, the infinite must be made present within the finite, and that the finite nature is infinite. And there's a strong religious divide between the Christians and the pagans, because the Christians and the Abrahamic religions are the religions of the transcendence. They say that the infinite is far above the finite. But they contradict themselves, because Christianity is the religion in which the infinite, namely God, made himself finite through Christ, which is God made human, to reveal himself to mankind. So paganism is the religion which seeks the infinite within the finite, and Christianity is the religion which says that the infinite becomes finite through Christ. So they are opposed, but they are nonetheless the same, because they both say the same thing. Yeah. And there's this idea that in the 18th century, in the middle of the 18th century, Rousseau, which was my first intellectual love story, that's another story, tried to rehabilitate nature, which has been discredited and discarded since Descartes, for 150 years broadly, since Bacon and Descartes and Newton and the Enlightenment and Locke, etc., etc. Nature had lost its sense of numinous, of the presence of the divine and the supernatural, and Rousseau was a romantic. He was not strictly speaking a romantic, he was a pre-romantic, lost in the age of enlightenment, and he tried to rehabilitate a sense of a feeling of nature, the value of the feeling as against reason, the value of the instinct as against reflection, the primordial purity, moral purity and wholeness of man. For Rousseau, nature was a state of goodness of man, whereas for people like Hobbes, nature was the realm of violent struggle and death and conflict. And Rousseau tried to express his experience of the world in terms of feeling, positive instinct, a primordial unity, a primordial goodness. So it's a very Christian idea that in the primordial past, so to speak, we were in the Garden of Eden, and then separation occurred, the fall, the original sin, and then we were separated from God and separated from one another, and we suffered. That's a very Christian idea. So we have the Age of Enlightenment, which is the attempt to negate the church. At least in France, it was an attack against the church and against the divine, so to speak. Not all Enlightenment thinkers were atheists, but there were many materialists, and their idea of God was so reduced to insignificance that one could say they were all atheists, basically. Not all, but most of them. And the Age of Enlightenment, which was the age of der Verstand, of classical reason, which is still held today as a reference point for many enlightened thinkers like Steven Pinker and even the atheist intellectuals. They still believe that the 18th century was some sort of apex or highest point of reason, and that we should draw inspiration from the Age of Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment, which was mostly French, Scottish, partly German with philosophers like Kant, a little bit Italian, but it was mostly a French, English, Scottish, a little bit German movement, gave birth, as in a dialectical reaction, to Romanticism, which was originally German, although Rousseau had influenced the German, and with people like Herder and partly Goethe, who was not strictly a romantic, but he was partly influenced. Novalis, Schelling, the Schlegel brothers. It was a revival of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was widely admired by the Romantics for his Dionysian, one could say, if we use the categories of Nietzsche, view of life and the world, and his exuberant genius, one could speak. This mixture of comedy and tragedy and magic and drama and Shakespeare is very difficult to understand for a Frenchman, because we in France we have classical serious authors and comical authors, and they do not mix with one another, and in Shakespeare everything is mixed together. So for a Frenchman it's difficult to understand Shakespeare. It's difficult literally because the English is a very high level, but also conceptually. But there is genius in Shakespeare, obviously. And it was also a revival of Spinoza, who had a divinized view of nature. For Spinoza, nature was God, or was the body of God. And he inspired the Romantics, who wanted to have a divine experience of nature. And poetry in the Romantic era started to liberate itself from the limiting rules of classical aesthetics. So we find again this polarity between Apollo and Dionysos, which are two modes of manifesting part of the European spirit, I guess. And Nietzsche understood that very well. And some said that the early Nietzsche was a romantic thinker. That's questionable, but he was a profoundly European thinker, although he criticized Europe. But can you name one European who did not criticize Europe? What if Europe was nothing but self-criticism? Maybe that's the truth about Europe, I don't know. The Romantic era started symbolically with Rousseau as a pre-Romantic, and then it bursted in Germany, and then it influenced England. There were great Romantic thinkers in England, and it came later in France. In France, it was in the up until the middle of the 19th century, so it came later in France. But Romanticism was a European movement, because the three greatest nations, Germany, France, and England, had their Romantic moments, not at the same chronological time, but in the continuity. And I know that Schelling was widely read among the Romantic poets of England, and yeah. It was a rediscovery of the value and the magic of the popular folk songs. There was an emphasis on the Romanticism was tied and attached to nationalism, because there was value in the spontaneous outburst of creativity and exuberance and life of the people in its capability of producing meaning through the songs, the tales, the fairy tales, the epics. He mentioned the Nordic mythology. The Hindu mythology was being rediscovered because of English sea travels. The Hindu literature was being rediscovered in Germany, as far as I know, and that's when the idea of the Indo-Germanischen, the Indo-European languages and Indo-European people started to become manifest to the consciousness of Europeans, because they discovered that there were grammatical structures between the Indian Sanskrit language and the most European language, like Latin, ancient Greece, German, and all the modern languages, etc. There was a revival of the Homeric epics, of Gothic art, and also classical art. And Europe is such a complex idea, one could say. The story of Europe in the political, artistic, intellectual sphere is so wealthy. There is so much wealth in Europe. The Renaissance was an age of outburst. The 17th century was different. The 18th century was in the continuity of the 17th, but it was still different. And then we have Romanticism, which again is an outburst of creativity, of life, of spontaneous genius, of conflicting ideas, of conflicted tendencies, of various manifestations of polarities of the European spirit. But it's that which makes the genius of Europe. And one cannot help but admire the creative genius of Europe. So there were parallels being made between the influence on Shakespeare upon Romanticism and the influence of Spinoza upon speculative philosophy. Spinoza influenced Schelling and Hegel, and he was a thinker who had a view of the unity of man with what he calls the one substance, which is God, and the unity of God and nature, and the unity of all things. And he was considered to be the hero of the philosophy of nature, and he inspired people like Herder and Goethe and Schelling, so Germans, who wanted to re-establish what I talked about at the beginning of the video, the sense of the numinous, the magical, the divine within nature, to re-establish the sense of unity which had been lost by the separation brought forth by modern science. Nature was seen as the living source of universal energy instead of a dead succession of causes and effects. And we still find today in the pagan communities, the pagan Europeans who are searching for their identity, they are searching for this, what they call the energies. We can find this in some pagan women and pagan men who seek to re-establish a sense of unity with nature. And this is a profound tendency of the European soul. Mind and matter were considered to be one by Spinoza. They were two attributes of the one infinite substance. And in paganism, which is partly Romanticism actualized in the 21st century, I'm talking about the revival of modern paganism, the deity or the divine or the spirits, as they call it, is seen as immanent. So the transcendence must be found within the immanent experience of the world. And the age of Romanticism was the beginning of the history of nature and of an evolutionary organic view and a unifying view of the universe. And it was not yet Darwin, but there was this idea of evolution still being thought of and being envisioned. And in the modern day, in our day and age, the missing link between nature and spirit is sociobiology, because we have this idea, which is developed in the educational system and the media, etc., that there is absolutely no connection between what you are ethnically or biologically and how you think, between the body and the mind. But sociobiology teaches us that we are partly influenced, not totally, but we are partly influenced by our biological nature, that depending on your ethnicity and your race, you have tendencies which are particular to you. All races can agree in the purely universal mind, but each ethnicity has its own Volk soul, in German its own Volkgeist, spirit of the people, or soul of the people. And to rediscover one's own ethnic ancestry is a moment in the development of the pagan consciousness. And all the pagans almost who are drawn towards the revival of paganism, they are white Europeans. And they have different views depending on whether they are Southern Europeans or Slavic, Eastern Europeans, or Nordic Europeans, or... Yeah. There was this idea, which we find expressed best in Schelling, but also in many Romantic thinkers, that nature, the world of matter and energy and time and space and organism, becomes sensation, that an organism, a developed organism, is a natural being. It's not separated from nature, it is in the continuity of nature. It is nature becoming sensuous, having a sensuous experiment of itself, and organisms are moved by desire, the desire to maintain their identity and to reproduce themselves. So nature becomes sensation and desire, and in man, nature becomes thought. We find this idea in Fichte and Schelling, the idea that nature is, that man is nature reflecting upon itself. That we, that is Schelling, which says that we are nature philosophizing. I am a product of nature in this view. I am the succession of all my ancestors, and so are you. And our ancestors come from primitive organisms, which themselves come from chemicals and from material beings. And the whole history of the cosmos has led us to become conscious modes of nature. And we are, when we think about the world, we think about ourselves. And there's a poem by Schelling which says that a gigantic spirit, an overwhelming spirit, is being, or is petrified, and seeks to become conscious of itself. And this spirit is trapped in a prison that we call human. So there's this idea, which is a cosmotheist idea, and cosmotheism is a doctrine developed by William Pierce, which was a right-wing European, if there ever was one, that we are the cosmos becoming conscious of itself, and that we are cosmic beings. We are spiritual beings, and our bodies are prisons. That's a Platonic idea. They are limiting manifestations of ourselves, but that in our nature we are infinite. We are infinitely vast. We are the whole cosmos, which has become in a self-relation, in an infinite relation with itself. That when we are contemplating nature, we are contemplating our own substance. That is the cosmotheist view. And Giordano Bruno, who was a thinker of the Renaissance, saw the earth and the stars as having a life of their own. And in astrology, which is a topic of interest in the pagan community, not only the pagan, but some pagans are interested in astrology, there's this idea that the life of the stars and the planets has an influence upon us, because this is an idea that I discovered by myself. It's not me who discovered it, it's the cosmos who discovered itself through me. But the idea that the stars cannot speak, but we can speak, and we are made of stardust, and the atoms which compose our body, that's well known in modern science. Even Krauss, Mr. Krauss, the atheist, who says that the universe comes out of nothing, which is true, but not as he thinks it is, that the stars exploded and they died so that we could be born. He says, forget Jesus, the stars died so that you could be born. It's a poetic way of praising the cosmos. But the atoms which constitute my body and your body were present when the stars which made them come into being exploded. So we have this traumatic experience. The atoms do not think and do not feel, but we are made of atoms and we think and we feel. So in our psyche there remains the traumatic experience of the violence, and also the beauty of this moment of cosmic evolution, so to speak. So the Romantics saw an internal life, a spiritual side of nature, and nature by the modern rationalists, as being born in the 17th and 18th century and still being developed by many scientists today, is seen by the scientific mind as an aggregate of things that man can exploit for his own purpose. And this view of nature as an aggregate of dead objects that is just there to be used and exploited, this conflict still exists in the political realm between the capitalists, so to speak, and the classical Marxists, and the ecologically minded people. And the ecologists, unconsciously, they have a pagan view. And the pagans, when they are a serious pagan, they become ecologists and ecologically minded. So all the conflicts of politics and religion and economics, they are philosophical problems which structure and shape the entire development of European thought. And many today accuse the white man with his rationalist mind of having hurt nature. Descartes is accused of having promoted the destruction of nature. He was a white man, and people hate the white man for having introduced separation and division and exploitation in nature, which is partly true. But it is also in the white history and the history of Europe that we have seen the most ambitious attempts to re-establish this primordial unity. And the history of Europe is a conflict between the classical scientific mind and the Dionysian romantic mind, and this conflict keeps reappearing in various forms, each time different, throughout the whole history of Europe. And the author says that Descartes, Kant, and Fichte saw the self, which is consciousness, the mind, as opposed to a dead object. So Descartes, Kant, and Fichte, they are rationalist thinkers. Fichte was more complex, was more speculative than both Descartes and Kant, but the three nonetheless saw the I, the self, the transcendental ego, to speak like Kant, as being in an opposition to the objective world. And this opposition is a source of conflict and of suffering also. And for Hegel, this thinking mind is what he calls the concept. And the concept is one with its world, which is just the manifestation of the concept. And the concept, which is reason for Hegel, must become totalitarian to totally re-establish its identity with itself. And for Hegel, he began as he was the historical Hegel was trained as a theologian, and he had a Christian background, but he in his youth attacked Christianity indirectly and blamed the Judeo-Christian religion for being responsible for a feeling of alienation and separation and unhappiness. And he was a big fan of ancient Greece and the city of the city-state, exemplified by Athens, for having a sense of a community of a unity of man with the ethical life of the community and the life of the cosmos. And the young Hegel was partly pagan, and these kind of questions, which are deep philosophical problems, we still find them today in the pagan community. People who complain about the Abrahamic religions and the Abrahamic influence. What they mean is that for them, the Abrahamic religions are the religions of separation, of a transcendence so far above that the finite is left empty. And they blame Judaism or Christianity or Islam for being responsible for alienation and separation and unhappiness and suffering. And they want to re-establish a presence of the divine within the world. And this is paganism. And for Hegel, nature, so Hegel began as a romantic thinker, but he later became a a speculatively totalitarian thinker, who saw nature as the negative of the idea, as the negative of the mind of God. So in the view of Schelling, the mind was the product of nature. In the continuity of nature, for Hegel, nature is the product of the mind. And yeah, that's what I wanted to share. But what people will not watch this video because it's too long, and yeah, but what I want to express is that I speak here as a European. The history of our people is so rich in creative genius and contradictions and conflicts and oppositions also, but in all spheres of European life, whether it is political, cultural, artistic, religious, philosophical, Europe is so apart from all other peoples because there is so much wealth in Europe, and we do not find this in any other civilization. And all the opposition that we find within the history of Europe are opposition that we still find today because they keep coming back again and again. And the divide between the technologically, economically minded capitalists, the libertarians, and the ecologically minded leftists, most of them are white in the Western world. These are conflicts between whites. The conflict between the white Christians and the white pagans, between the various artistic sensibilities. So what I want to express is that the white race and the European people is such a complex and profound and rich, also rich in contradiction, one might say, but rich in the development of thoughts and expressions of various sorts. So that was what I wanted to say. Yeah.